Trump's populist campaign.
Populism.
There's a populism.
Populist.
He is pretty much a pure populist.
The 2016 election has brought out the best and worst of politics, but if were to be described in one word, I would use intriguing or exciting. It's saturated with scandal, 18th century mudslinging,
principle, and I'll tell you,
liar.
and the fear and excitement from the possibility of both parties collapsing. And this amount of drama that Americans so dearly love is exaggerated through the different campaigns' use of social media. It's hard to believe that Donald Trump agreed to debate Bernie Sanders on Jimmy Kimmel.
No, he wants to know if you will debate
Yes,
him.
I am. How much is he going to pay me?
And then see that Bernie Sanders responded on Twitter. And now the two presumptive nominees went to personally attack each other on Twitter. Somehow the usual trudge through the year-and-a-half American presidential electoral process in which an entire nation becomes split for a period, and then seemingly goes back to normal the day after the election day until the next election 4 years later, has become, at least for some, electrifying. This may not be the case for the rest of the election, but at least during the primary season. This buzz and excitement can be seen when the hashtag primary day trends at the top during a primary election day. This election has been frustrating, as usual, and most would say surprising, but I would argue it's not very surprising at all. If you look at the trends of American history, we can see that this election is just another phase of history. Or unless Donald Trump becomes president. It will be here, come to pass, and in 20 years will cease to be another phase in the swinging pendulum of American politics. The pendulum of politics, meaning the flipping of the mood of the majority of the country on the political spectrum. Lasting on average 15 years, the country, when satisfied with the amount of change or no change, will move towards the other side of the spectrum. For example, the progressive movement kicked off the 20th century as a very liberal left movement. Even in the election of 1912, all four main candidates could be labeled as progressive, both Republican and Democrat. During the 20s and the post-World War I economic boom, when the country turned inward and isolated, we immediately swerved right into the world of credit, stocks, and wealth. But at its most prosperous moment, the wealthy became too rich, and the Great Depression ensued, causing FDR's liberal agenda to run its course until the post-World War II conservative baby boom in the 1950s. Of course, this could go on and on until present day, but I think the point has been proved. This energy and excitement, though not always peaceful, have been primarily coming from the Sanders and Trump campaigns, and one of the more popular words to describe these candidates is populist. But most of America who probably couldn't identify our current vice president, I'd expect, wouldn't know what populism is. Populism, by definition, is a political ideology and philosophy that supports the rights and power of the people against a more elite class. Essentially, it's a political strategy, whether the politician really believes in it or not, is a way of appealing to middle to lower classes, the majority of America, against the more wealthy.
That corporate greed is destroying our economy, that almost all of the new income and wealth being generated is going to the top 1%.
You know, the system, folks, is rigged. It's a rigged system.
Although the word populism is very ambiguous, that can be connected to a variety of points in American history, the origins of populism can give great insight to why it matters today. Populism gained its first followers in the late 19th century when American farmers saw their crop prices skyrocket, mostly due to overproduction and increasingly efficient farming methods, even if they didn't want to admit it, and these farmers already had to take large loans for land and tools. Along with the fact that currency at the time was only backed by gold, causing deflation, and the shrinking crop prices, farmers became in serious debt. With the rise of industrialism, big business tycoons like J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller had immense political and economic influence on local and state governments. Corruption ran rampant as political bosses paid incoming immigrants to vote for them in exchange for a low-paying job and minimal housing. The farmers eventually became fed up and decided to organize, creating the Farmers Alliance in 1875, and they found their chance at change in politics in 1892 when the Populist Party was formed. The Populist Party was an active organization on the grievances of the farmers, but also an attempt to put the power back to the people during the nicknamed Gilded Age of America.
Thus has the contest been waged, and we have assembled here under as binding and solemn instructions as were ever imposed upon the representatives of the people.
A lot of the populist ideas laid the basis for the progressive movement a few years later, so it's no wonder why the populist agenda is very similar to Bernie Sanders' agenda. Although a 120-year gap and differing social grievances of the time minorly divides the Bernie Sanders movement and the populist movement, the overall same type of change is what links the two. Sanders calls for tax increases for the wealthy and an end to the loopholes that allows corporations to delay paying federal income tax, while the populists called for the first graduated income tax. Sanders has also caused a spark in a call for the end of superdelegates, wanting direct election of the party's nominees. This is similar to the populists wanting the direct election of senators, which they got 20 years later. The populists fought for regulation of transportation and communication in the interests of the people, while Bernie Sanders wants net neutrality, encourages independent news sources, and believes that the 6 main media conglomerates, quote, violate the core principles of American government, letting the American people get divergent sources of information. Sanders' address of the increasing poverty by raising the minimum wage to $15 is not quite the same as wanting coinage of money, but it's similar in the light that it's a want for change in order to economically help the lower class. Bernie Sanders is more directly an echo of the Populist Party, the later progressive movement, and liberal left populism. While Bernie Sanders shares key ideas with the Populist Party, Donald Trump's populism is more so connected to the 1960s candidate George Wallace's beginning of conservative populism, but more ambiguous. Donald Trump embodies the emotional, big-picture side of populism, because his political views are less definitive and could change on the spot, which he has done so many times since he became the presumptive nominee.
The thing I'm going to do is make sure the middle class gets good tax breaks, because they have been absolutely shunned. The other thing, I'm going to fight very hard for business. For the wealthy, I think, frankly, it's going to go up. And you know what? It really should go up.
His rhetoric, language, and abstract ideas, rather than his policies, are why so many call him a populist. The common thought among America is that Trump supporters are working class and are less educated, and studies show that this is and isn't true. But this doesn't matter, because if Trump gives the illusion and says with great emphasis that we aren't getting good deals, while the corrupt elite party establishment is rigged, or that America isn't great anymore, and overall paints a picture that these things are of a more elite structure that is taking advantage of the American people, his rhetoric has worked, and he can gain support from anyone, regardless of previous party affiliation or voting record. But Donald Trump's new type of populism can be traced back to the phases of immigration reform in the United States as well. Donald Trump is barking a modern version of nativism, the fear that aliens and immigrants will essentially change and ruin the American dream and traditional culture. In the 1840s and 50s, a majority of immigrants were Irish and German that were mostly Catholic. A huge wave of nativism swept through the country in an attempt to preserve America's culture and force these immigrants to assimilate into American culture that sometimes ended in violence and death. And when newer immigrants started to arrive from Southern and Eastern Europe 30 years later, the same immigrants that were once persecuted became the persecutors, even though they could empathize with these new immigrants and were previously in their same shoes. But they were motivated by fear that the indoctrinated principles of American freedom, hard work, and a sense of American self-righteousness for being born here that we hold so dear could be lost to these non-Americans, even though every American is a product of immigration, legal or illegal, except for Native Americans. At the beginning of the year, it seemed as though the GOP may be on track for a 1912-esque convention, like when Teddy Roosevelt was denied the nomination, caused chaos within the party, and cost them the election when he went third party as a progressive and split the Republican vote. But every day, it seems this may be the path for the Democrats. Roosevelt won all the primaries except for Massachusetts, while Taft won most of the caucuses, but neither had the magic number of 540 at the time leading up to the convention. Although there were no superdelegates at the time, 254 delegates were left to be fought over on the convention floor. Similar to the Democratic establishment's connection to Hillary, Taft won 235 while Roosevelt only gained 19. Also that year, socialist Eugene V. Debs gained significant support in 1912. The 2016 election has inarguably been a wild ride.
Hold on, gentlemen, I'm going to turn this car around.
But it's less surprising when put up against the rest of American history and politics. The general election is just starting, but with Bernie Sanders currently staying in the race, Hillary's emails hanging over her head, and Donald Trump's favorability ratings plummeting, who knows what will happen at the Philadelphia convention and the many months until the election day in November.